It had been 3 years since Eric Johnson moved into Oak Ridge Estates, a quiet, upper-middle-class suburban community just outside Atlanta, Georgia. On paper, it was the ideal neighborhood: flawless lawns, tree-lined streets, and elegant homes with spacious porches. A place where neighbors smiled and where life was meant to be peaceful. But there was one problem, a problem named Karen Whitmore. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was its ruler. A woman in her mid-50s with a year-round tan, a collection of pastel pantsuits, and an unshakable belief that she alone could dictate the way Oak Ridge Estates should be run. She didn't just enforce the rules, she created them, especially when it suited her. And from the moment Eric moved in, Karen had her sights set on him. At first, it was small things, a notice in the mail about how his trash bins were too visible from the street, even though his neighbors did the same. A warning about his lawn needing to be more in line with community standards, despite it being perfectly maintained. A fine for an oil stain in his driveway, so faint it was practically invisible. He saw the pattern immediately. Other residents made similar infractions, but only Eric received official violations. It was never about the rules. It was about control, and Karen wanted him gone. Eric knew exactly why. He was one of the only black homeowners in Oak Ridge Estates, and Karen's passive-aggressive tactics weren't subtle. But he had learned to pick his battles, to let some things slide. After all, she was annoying, but she wasn't unstoppable, until the day she crossed the line. One Friday afternoon, Eric's 72-year-old mother, Diane Johnson, arrived from Chicago for a surprise visit. She had never seen her son's new home and wanted to spend some quality time with him. Diane was a retired teacher, kind-hearted, sharp, and fiercely protective of her son. She had raised him alone, putting him through college and graduate school while working 2 jobs. Eric was thrilled to see her, but Karen wasn't. The next morning, Eric had to leave early for work, leaving Diane alone in the house. She sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee and enjoying the peaceful quiet of the neighborhood. Then, a knock at the door. Diane opened it to see a thin, stiff woman standing there, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. Karen. Her lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You must be visiting." Diane gave a polite nod. "That's right, I'm Eric's mother." Karen's smile faltered. "And do you happen to have a guest permit?" Diane frowned. "A what?" Karen sighed dramatically, flipping a page on her clipboard. "All overnight guests are required to have an official HOA guest permit, signed by the board." Diane's eyebrows lifted. "That's ridiculous. Eric never mentioned that." Karen let out a small, patronizing chuckle. "Well, given recent incidents, we've had to tighten security. I'm sure you heard about the vandalism near the neighborhood last month. Some very suspicious individuals were seen lurking around, and we simply can't be too careful." Diane's polite demeanor hardened. She could hear the unspoken meaning behind those words. Karen continued, lowering her voice slightly. "It's a safety measure. I mean, you wouldn't want anything happening in a lovely community like this, right? That's why all unexpected guests need to be documented." Diane folded her arms. "So you're telling me a mother can't visit her own son without jumping through hoops?" Karen tisked. "We're just ensuring proper protocol is followed. Since I wasn't notified of your arrival, I'll have to issue a fine." Diane blinked. "A fine?" Karen nodded solemnly. $1,500. Diane's jaw nearly hit the floor. $1,500? For what? Karen kept her expression neutral, as if she wasn't making up the rule on the spot. For failing to submit a guest request in advance. She turned the clipboard toward Diane, pointing at an empty section under Visitor Approvals. "Your name isn't listed. That means unauthorized residency." Diane's voice turned ice cold. "That's absurd." Karen shrugged. "Rules are rules. I'd hate for this to become a bigger issue." Diane could barely contain her anger as Karen turned on her heel and walked away, clipboard clutched tightly in her manicured fingers. Eric arrived home that evening, exhausted from work, expecting a quiet dinner with his mother. Instead, he barely had time to set down his keys before Diane stormed into the room. Her face was tight with frustration. "Baby, we need to talk," she said, her voice laced with worry. Eric immediately tensed. "What's wrong?" Diane exhaled, trying to steady herself, but the frustration boiled over. That woman, Karen, came knocking on the door this morning, demanding some kind of guest permit. She said it was a new rule. Eric's brows furrowed. A guest permit? She acted like it was serious, Eric, like I was breaking some law by being here. Diane sat down on the couch, rubbing her temples. I didn't want to cause trouble for you, but I had no idea if it was real or not. The way she talked about security and all those incidents, it sounded official. Eric sighed, running a hand down his face. Mom, she's lying. Diane hesitated. Are you sure? Yes? His voice was firm. She's making it up, probably because she saw you were black and thought she could intimidate you. Diane shook her head, still troubled. I don't want you getting into trouble with your home. This isn't like when you were renting apartments. You own this place. You've worked too hard for some sneaky HOA rules to mess that up. Eric sat beside her, his anger now mixed with guilt. His mother had spent her whole life protecting him, and now she was worried that her presence might put his home at risk. That's exactly what she wants, he muttered, to make us feel like we don't belong. Diane pursed her lips. So what do we do? Just pay the fine? Eric shook his head. Hell no! I'm going to find out exactly what's legal and what's not. If she's bluffing, I'll shut this down. Diane finally let out a small sigh of relief. Good. Because I didn't come all this way just to be bullied by some HOA woman with a clipboard. Eric cracked a small smile. Now that's the woman who raised me. That night, he pulled out his laptop and started digging. He wasn't just going to fight this. He was going to win. Eric barely slept that night. He sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee going cold beside him, his laptop screen glowing in the dimly lit room. He pored over every HOA document he could find, community guidelines, bylaws, amendments, anything that mentioned guest policies. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he kept scrolling, scanning line after line. Nothing. Not a single mention of a guest permit, no rule about visitors needing approval, no policy stating that homeowners had to notify the HOA about their family staying over. Karen had lied. Again. His anger simmered, but he didn't stop there. If this wasn't real, there had to be a way to fight back. He sent out emails to the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, the state HOA Regulatory Board, and even a local housing rights attorney. He didn't know how long it would take for a response, but he wasn't waiting around. Karen wasn't just a petty nuisance anymore. She was crossing a legal line. The next morning, his phone buzzed with an email from the HOA board. Subject, HOA Guest Permit Inquiry ** from Oak Ridge Estates, HOA Board, to Eric Johnson. Dear Mr. Johnson, your concerns regarding the guest permit requirement will be addressed at our upcoming HOA meeting. As a reminder, all homeowners are encouraged to participate in discussions regarding neighborhood policies. The next scheduled HOA meeting will take place on Tuesday, 11 a.m. We hope to see you there. Sincerely, Oak Ridge Estates, HOA Board. Eric stared at the screen, his stomach twisting with frustration. 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. Karen had done this on purpose. She knew most working residents wouldn't be able to attend. The only people who could make it? Retirees, stay-at-home spouses, and Karen's hand-picked allies, the ones who wouldn't question her authority. He clenched his jaw. It was a setup. Eric grabbed his phone and called his boss. Hey, I need to take off Tuesday morning, he said, trying to sound casual. There was a long pause. Tuesday? His boss finally said. That's short notice, Eric. We've got the client meeting at 10. Eric rubbed his forehead. I know, but this is important. Another pause. His boss sighed. Is it an emergency? Eric hesitated. Technically, no. But if he didn't go, Karen would railroad him. It's something I have to handle personally, he said carefully. His boss wasn't convinced. Look, I like you, Eric, but I can't have you skipping work for some HOA dispute. Can't this wait? No, Eric said, his voice sharper than he intended. He took a breath, trying to stay calm. If I miss this meeting, they'll push through a rule that'll cost me $1,500, and if they get away with it once, they'll do it again. His boss let out a frustrated sigh. Damn HOA nonsense. All right, but I need you back by noon, no later. Understood, Eric said, relief washing over him. Thank you. He hung up and exhaled slowly. Karen thought she could back him into a corner. She had no idea he was about to fight back. And before stepping into that meeting, he'd make sure he was armed with facts, law, and a plan to shut her down. The Oak Ridge clubhouse had the same polished wood floors and tasteful decor as the rest of the neighborhood. Clean, elegant, and completely fake, just like the HOA board running it. Eric pushed open the heavy doors, stepping inside. The room fell silent. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, and at the far end, Karen Whitmore sat like a queen on her throne. She was flanked by her loyal enforcers, 3 older white men, 2 elderly women, all people who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. They had known Karen long enough to trust her word without question. Eric immediately noticed the empty seats. This wasn't a real HOA meeting, it was a Karen rally. She had stacked the board with her supporters and scheduled it at a time where only her allies could attend. The people who actually worked for a living had no chance of making it. Karen's lips curled into a smug, condescending smirk. "Ah, Eric." She gestured toward an empty seat across from her. "I assume you're here about the fine?" Eric ignored the chair. Instead, he walked right up to the table and dropped a thick folder onto its glossy surface. The sound echoed in the tense silence. "Actually," he said, flipping open the cover, "I'm here to talk about something else." Karen's expression stiffened for just a second. Eric pulled out the first page and slid it across the table. Georgia HO laws. No guest permit requirement exists. Fair Housing Act. Selective enforcement of rules can be classified as harassment. Consumer protection laws. Illegal fees can result in fines against the HOA itself. Karen's eyebrow twitched. One of the older board members adjusted his glasses, clearly caught off guard. Karen, however, didn't even blink. Instead, she let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and leaned back in her chair. "Oh, Eric," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm afraid you just don't understand how HOA regulations work." Eric clenched his jaw. "I understand, just fine." He reached into his pocket and tossed 2 business cards onto the table. "I spoke with the local housing authority and the state consumer protection office. They're very interested in how you're enforcing rules that don't exist." Silence. For a brief moment, Karen's mask slipped. Her eyes flashed with something sharp and cold. Then, just as quickly, she plastered on a bright, patronizing smile. "Well," she said, flipping through her clipboard, "HOA regulations are always evolving to protect the integrity of the community. If you'd bothered to read the guidelines properly, you'd know that homeowner safety is our top priority." One of her lackeys, a wiry man with graying hair, nodded enthusiastically. Karen pounced on the moment. "With the recent vandalism in the area, it's only natural we'd want to be extra cautious about who stays overnight. Guest permits are a necessary precaution." Eric's eyes narrowed. "Then why does the rule only apply to me?" Karen gasped, placing a dramatic hand over her chest. "Eric, are you seriously accusing this board of—" She gave a little chuckle. "Of discrimination? That's quite an allegation." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of the older women cleared her throat. "Karen, if the rule isn't written down anywhere—" Karen cut her off instantly. "It is written down. It just hasn't been updated in the new version of the homeowner manual." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Then show me the old version." Karen sighed loudly, shaking her head. "I'm afraid I don't have it on me right now." Convenient. The older man on the board frowned. "Karen, I think we should focus on the real issue here," Karen snapped. "A homeowner blatantly ignored a community request and is now trying to fight it with—" She waved a dismissive hand at Eric's documents. "Legal loopholes." Eric felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. "This isn't a loophole," he said, voice low and controlled. "You made up a rule, enforced it on one person, and issued an illegal fine. That's called harassment." Karen laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, Eric," she cooed, "I know you're upset, but making threats against your own community isn't the way to solve your problems." Eric took a step forward, placing both hands on the table. "I'm not making threats," he said. "I'm making a promise." He leaned in. "If this fine isn't dropped immediately," he said, his voice unwavering, "I will sue this HOA." Karen's eyes hardened. For the first time, her confidence wavered. Eric could feel the shift in the room. The board members were no longer looking at Karen like their fearless leader. Now, they were looking at her like a liability. Karen's face had been unreadable when Eric dropped the final blow in the HOA meeting. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. Instead, she smiled, a slow, stiff, calculating smile. That evening, an official HOA email went out to the neighborhood. The fine was dropped. No apology, no explanation. Just a sterile one-line message stating that after reviewing policy, the fine against Eric Johnson had been rescinded. But Eric knew better than to believe Karen would let it go. And he was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen made her pettiness known. Eric received 3 separate warnings about his trash bins, each one nitpicking something new. Placement too close to the curb, not properly secured, and finally, bins should not be visible from the street. A letter appeared in his mailbox about the color of his front door, stating that it was not within the neutral palette of the community. His door was the same deep brown it had been since he moved in. The neighborhood landscapers, who had never once touched his lawn, suddenly mistakenly cut his grass lower than anyone else's, leaving his yard looking scalped and uneven. One morning, his mailbox was missing. HOA protocol required an official report for replacement, which meant Karen would have to approve it. Eric didn't react. He didn't storm into another meeting. He didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight because he knew something Karen didn't. Other residents were starting to talk. Her reign was crumbling. The whispers began as soon as the story of Eric's fine spread through the neighborhood. At first, it was small things. An elderly couple mentioned how Karen had rejected their request for a wheelchair ramp because it disrupted the uniformity of the sidewalks. A single mom shared how Karen had fined her for having a guest living in her home, when it was really her younger brother, staying with her while looking for an apartment. Another homeowner admitted that his landscaping bills had gone up 40% since Karen took over, yet the HOA's budget never reflected an increase in community maintenance. By the end of the second week, enough people had come forward that a formal complaint was submitted to the State Housing Authority. Karen Whitmore was under investigation. On a quiet Thursday evening, a single email arrived in every homeowner's inbox. Subject: HOA President Resignation. Karen Whitmore had stepped down. No details, no speech, no dramatic farewell. Just a curt 2-sentence statement announcing her immediate resignation due to personal reasons. A week later, her house went up for sale. By the end of the month, she was gone. And the neighborhood never looked better. With Karen gone, Oak Ridge Estates felt different. The air seemed lighter, the tension that had once settled over the neighborhood now lifting. For the first time in years, Eric could step outside without expecting a passive-aggressive letter in his mailbox. The new HOA president, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, was the complete opposite of Karen. A retired attorney in her 60s, she believed in fairness, transparency, and treating people like adults rather than subjects in a kingdom. One of her first actions, eliminating Karen's so-called guest permit policy and refunding every fine she had issued under her reign. HOA is meant to serve homeowners, not control them, she had said during her first meeting. And for the first time, Eric believed it. Over the next few months, life in Oak Ridge Estates found balance again. HOA meetings were moved to reasonable hours, allowing more residents to participate. New policies were reviewed openly, ensuring fairness for all homeowners. Landscaping fees were properly audited, uncovering budget discrepancies that had mysteriously vanished under Karen's leadership. There were no more petty fines, no more mysterious rule changes, no more selective enforcement. People smiled more, neighbors talked again. The community felt like a place where everyone belonged. One evening, as Eric sat on his porch with his mother watching the sunset, Diane sighed contentedly. "Feels like home now, doesn't it?" Eric smiled, finally at ease. "It does, Mom. It really does." What about Karen? She didn't take her downfall well. After resigning from the HOA, she quietly put her house on the market and moved out of Oak Ridge Estates. No grand farewell, no final words, just an empty house and a for sale sign. She relocated to a smaller, less exclusive community across town, where no one knew her name, and more importantly, where she had no power. But old habits die hard. Within weeks, Karen tried to insert herself into her new neighborhood's HOA. She showed up at board meetings, critiqued the landscaping, and emailed the president friendly reminders about community standards. Unlike Oak Ridge Estates, however, her new neighbors weren't having it. The HOA president, an ex-military woman with zero patience for nonsense, shut her down immediately. "We don't do things that way here, Karen," she had said flatly. "You're just another homeowner." For the first time in years, Karen was forced to live under rules she couldn't control. Instead of leading, she spent her days scrolling Facebook, complaining in local community groups, and leaving passive-aggressive comments on the Nextdoor app. But no one cared. In Oak Ridge Estates, life had moved on. And Karen? She was just another bitter ex-president with nowhere left to rule.